Tonight to welcome Cathy Severson, one of our own PAS members. Cathy is the whiz behind the newsletter, if you didn't know that. She spends a lot of time on that, and we appreciate it. As a watercolor painter, photographer, and bird enthusiast, it was not surprising that Cathy would be drawn to the art of John James Audubon. The passion to learn more about the man and his art resulted from her desire to focus on photographing small birds in the tops of trees that came in early 2022. This is an adapted presentation that was originally created for the Prescott Art Docents. Please welcome Cathy.
Hello. All right. Can you hear me? Let me go. What are we doing? Can you hear me? That's better? It really wants to be right on my little lips. Okay, I can do that. It's going to drive me crazy, but I can do it. Okay, all right. I'm going to start off with a question. In 1895, oops, hold on just a second. This is what happens when you don't use technology all of the time, and then you show up and you go, I haven't done anything like this for quite a few years. Okay. Don't touch that unless you want to move something. Got it. Okay. In 1895, two prominent Bostonian socialites were concerned about birds. And they decided to have teas around Boston, and they even called them Audubon teas. And it became so popular that it extended around the country. And so my question is, does anybody have any ideas what concerns they had about birds in 1895 that it prompted them to go out and have these teas and gather women up? What would it have been about? The feather industry is absolutely right. And I thought about that as I was going through this, and I go, that's citizen activism, and I bet that might have been the first actual group of citizens, because it ended up changing they were able to prompt and get legislation to end the industry. And so I thought that was kind of a cool thing. But one of the things that we know is that John James Audubon was revered and reviled in his life and beyond. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the man, and we're going to explore his life through his art and see where we end up. Now, normally with a talk like this, we kind of save the mass grandiose thing for the very end. But we're going to start off because I assume everybody here knows that he was responsible for the birds of America. But if you don't, you may not know that this is an original set. And I had no idea that they were this huge, that he wanted to do life-size. And they were produced, or they were printed between 1827 and 1838. And it contains 435 life-size watercolors of North American birds, containing over 1,000 individual birds. It is considered the archetype of wildlife illustration. He sold the 4-book series through a subscription basis in North America and Europe. The prints cost the subscriber around $1,000 in that money. Approximately 190 sets were produced. An original of the Birds of America was sold in 2018 for almost $10 million. And I looked it up today to see, because it's been a few years since I wrote this, and that's still that's the one that's still listed. So in 1863, New York State Historical Society purchased all the 435 Audubon watercolors, plus 34 other works. Today, the New York Historical has the largest holdings of Audubon-related material in the world. In 1966, American Heritage published the original watercolor paintings. Oops, can't do that finger. Okay. Anyway, my dad purchased those in 1966, and I brought those. I have to tell you, I purged books at least 4 major times in the last 20 years, and I keep my books, and I keep them. So if anybody wants to take a look at it, this was produced, and so yeah, it has been with me, well, since I was a young teenager. So I became serious with photography about 8 years ago. Retirement time, you know that. And it was in and I always loved the birds. I always loved photographing the landscapes and the birds in the areas. But it was in February. It was February 14th, 22. I went on my first Jay's bird barn birding thing. And damn, I was hooked. I mean, obsessively so. It was sad. But one of the things that stayed with me, because I was aware of these, is I would go and try to photograph in the trees, and I'd go, how did he do that? How did he do that? Because it's one thing to see a bird, to folks. Trust me, it's another thing to try to photograph it. And so I was intrigued, and it was as a result of that and coming out of COVID that the docents were trying to get people to start doing Zoom calls. And a lady called me and she said, would you be willing to do a talk? And I said, well, I'm interested in Audubon. And so I've adapted it a little bit for us, but this is how this talk came to be. So it all rests ultimately on his head. Oops, it's just going to... Okay, so John James Audubon was born in 1785 in Haiti, then called Saint Domingo, the illegitimate son of Jean Audubon, a French sea captain and a mistress. As a youngster, he would walk the land with his father, and both would marvel at nature. In a journal, Audubon explains that under his father's tutelage, he observed the behavior of birds, their habitats, differences in their eggs, and changes in their plumage, and grew up wishing to possess all that he saw. He would later write, in describing eggs of wild birds, I was taught to look upon them as flowers yet to bloom. In 1791, when John was 6, his father arranged for his children. Oh, just a second. Oh. Yes? I was there. Okay, then I forgot the order. That's okay. We'll get there. We'll get where we need to go. In 1791, when John was 6, I know what happened. Okay, when John was 6, his father arranged for he and his sister to be transported to stay with him in France. And the children were raised by Audubon's childless French wife. And biographers have accused John of not being a good student, but he played the flute and violin, learned to ride, fence, and dance, a great walker. He loved roaming the woods, often returning with natural curiosities, including birds' eggs and nests, of which he made crude drawings. He wrote, the production of nature that lay spread all around were constantly pointed out to me. They soon became my playmates. I felt that intimacy with them, not consisting of friendship merely, but bordering on frenzy, must accompany my steps through life. And now, more than ever, I am persuaded of the power of those early impressions. Now, his father had planned on him becoming a seaman. And so he went to military school and then became a cabin boy, only to find out that he was susceptible to seasickness. Oh, shocking. And not fond of mathematics or navigation, and failed the officer's qualification test. So that ended his naval career. Oh, shucks. And he was cheerfully back on solid ground, exploring the fields, and again, focusing on birds. This is where I got confused. In 1803, fearing conscription into Napoleon's army, John Audubon was sent. Oh, no, I did miss one. Okay, I missed a screen. I don't know what. I might go look for it. But somewhere along the line, Dad sold his land in the Caribbean and bought some land in Mill Grove, which is about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia. And so he had this. So, and I don't know what happened to that screen, but you just needed to know that, a valuable piece of information. So in 1803, fearing conscription into Napoleon's army, John Audubon was sent to the United States along with Claude Razier, who was to be his companion and business partner. Immediately upon my landing, he later wrote, prompted by an innate desire to acquire thorough knowledge of the birds of this happy country, innate desire to acquire thorough knowledge of the birds of this happy country. Audubon resolved to devote his spare time to drawing each American bird in its natural size and coloring. The land of Mill Grove contained a lead mine, but Audubon preferred its natural beauty to business. The house he lived in still stands as a museum displaying his paintings and prints. While he was there, he began drawing and painting birds and keeping journals of their behavior. Biographers point out that Audubon was self-taught. While he didn't have a formal training as a scientist or an artist, there were numerous role models who influenced him. One of the first influencers in the U.S. was Charles Willson Peale and his Philadelphia Museum, housed in the tower of the upper floors of the Pennsylvania State House. Peale wanted to create a venue people would pay to enter. His museum contained a mastodon, as well as a portrait gallery of the Revolutionary War heroes. It was a 100-foot-long room that housed over 700 American birds that most interested Audubon. And I thought that's a pretty impressive collection. Yeah. In a little cave on the banks of the Pokemon Creek, in 1805, Audubon conducted the first bird banding in America. Tying silver threads to the legs of phoebes or peewees, he discovered that they returned during the spring migration, just as they do to this day. Now, the first painting on the left was a painting he did in 1811 of the flycatcher or the eastern phoebe, and then we see this painting that he did of the same subject in 1825. And one of the things we're going to do as we go through this is look at how he grew as an artist and how his portraits of birds also grew. Later that year, in 1805, when 20 years old, Audubon spent a year with his family in France, where he rendered birds in pastels. He also gained his father's approval to marry Lucy Bakewell, daughter of William Bakewell, an Englishman who owned Fatland Ford, an estate adjoining Mill Grove. And this is a pastel painting that he did in 1805, yes, of the Eurasian nuthatch. So the following photos that we're going to look at are from a book called The Audubon Early Drawings that we have a copy in the Prescott Library. This is the Eurasian tree sparrow, and in July, that was done in July, which was with pastel, graphite, and in ink on paper. While in France, he met a naturalist and a physician who was a friend of his father's who helped Audubon improve his taxidermy and taught him scientific methods of research. Upon returning to the States, Audubon was eager for a new mentor and began to work with Samuel Latham Mitchell, who hired him to mount specimens. Mitchell was a U.S. senator physician who co-founded the first scientific journal in the U.S. called the Medical Repository. Mitchell's libraries would have been important to Audubon, who was teaching himself ornithology. And I have to tell you, I do mention it at the end of the thing, but one of the biggest questions that I still have, is how did he know it was one thing to see the birds, it's another thing to identify them. How did he know the names of these birds? So it was from people like this that he learned, but still, I never quite ever totally answered that question. So this is, oops, there I'd go, that finger again. No, there's a reason, and because if I put my mouse on where my speech is, it does one thing. If I put it over here, it does something else. It's not entirely my fault because I'm not used to the setups. And Audubon's predecessor typically skinned their specimens, preserved the skins with arsenic, stuffed them with frayed rope, and set them on the branches to draw them. The resulting drawings looked stiff and dead as their subjects. While he was at Mill Grove, Audubon developed techniques for passing wires through freshly killed birds to fix them in characteristic poses on which he based lifelike sketches. He wrote that he had shot the first kingfisher I met, wired the body so there stood before me the real kingfisher, and proceeded to execute what I shall call my first drawing actually from nature. And that's in 1808. Audubon was a complicated man, and this is also true of his relationship with his subjects. I have selected paintings that are representative of his art and his growth as a naturalist and as artist, and part of that is to provide a wide array of stories about his birds. This was done in 1806, and it's an osprey. Audubon dreamed of giving new life to his specimens. Even the colors of their feathers changed within 24 hours of death. Finding a way to mount freshly killed specimens on sharpened wires set into a gridded board allowed him to position them in lifelike attitudes. He drew them first, then filled in his drawings with watercolor that he burnished with a cork to imitate the metallic cast of feathers. After drawing, he often performed an anatomical dissection. Then, because he often worked deep in the wilderness, far from home, he cooked and ate his specimens. Deeming that the mining venture was too risky, with his father's approval, Audubon sold part of the Mill Grove farm, including the house and the mine. He retained some of the land for investment. In 1808, Audubon moved to Louisville, Kentucky, which was rapidly being settled. Take a moment to imagine the difficulty of traveling in the early 1800s. And how many people have bushwhacked to go find birds? Okay? But usually it's bushwhacking. Some of us have probably bushwhacked miles and miles, but mostly we're trail dependent. Somebody else has done all the work. And I just find it amazing what he had to do to find these and get out there. And he wrote about the difficulty in traveling overland and the need for using a machete to create a trail. 6 months after moving to Louisville, he married Lucy. Though their finances were tenuous, the Audubon started a family and a store with his partner, Razier. They had 2 sons, Victor and John, and 2 daughters who died while they were still young. Both sons would eventually help publish their father's works. After their marriage in 1808, Lucy Bockwell Audubon was a tower of strength, supporting her husband in times of trouble, raising their 2 sons, and working as a teacher while he traveled about as a portrait painter, music and fencing instructor, and eventually, he traveled around as a painter, but also teaching music and fencing, and eventually a painter of the birds of America. For most of their married life, she was an equal breadwinner while he traveled and drew. Keep that in mind. Of the time in Louisville, the store itself could have provided a good living, but Audubon's affinity for nature, rather than commerce, had not moderated with his move southward. Audubon wrote, "We had many goods and opened a large store in Louisville, which went on prosperously when I attended to it. But birds were birds. Then as now, and my thoughts were ever and on turning towards them as objects of my greatest delight. I shot, I drew, I looked on nature only. My days were happy beyond human conception. I seldom passed a day without drawing a bird or noting something respecting his habits. Rosier, meantime, attended the counter." Does that describe anybody in here? No names, just wondering. Audubon's monumental project was preceded by the work of several bird illustrators, notably a Scotsman, Alexander Wilson, who lived in Philadelphia and joined the encouragement of the city's influential scientific and intellectual community. A poet, self-trained artist, naturalist, Audubon traveled widely collecting specimens and making drawings, but using stuffed birds as models. His renderings appeared in 9 handsome volumes of American ornithology published between 1808 and 1814, with clear plates and accurate but rigid static likeness accompanied by graceful text. It was considered an accomplishment for a man with few resources other than his own ability. He and Audubon crossed paths twice, first in Audubon's store in Kentucky in 1810, and it's kind of believed that that was inspiring Audubon to do his own book. And then a couple of years later in Philadelphia, right before Wilson died. But look at the image, and you can see, get a sense of where Audubon wants to go. So this is goshawks and Cooper's hawks, and shows the evolution of Audubon's art as documented here. So can you tell which one? So this was painted in some birds were painted in 1809 and 1830. Can you look at that and see which ones were painted earlier? The bottom two. It's just really a difference. The Cooper's hawk in the lower right, an adult, and the goshawk were drawn in the, oops, I did it again. Got to keep that mouse over here. Where did you go? Oh, there you are. I lost it. No, seriously. Where did you go? There you are. Sorry. I mean, I apologize. But the Cooper's hawk in the lower right and the northern goshawk in the lower left, drawn early in the artist's career, appear as stuffed profile, consistent with the stylized manner of Wilson and others. The lively pose of the immature goshawk perched on the top, created after several decades in 1830, a first-hand observation, reflects Audubon's more mature style. Here's another example with screech owls done in 1809 and 1829. This is one of my favorite. In 1812, they did the house wren in pastel graphite and ink. When Audubon and Lucy were in Pennsylvania in 1812, he made a pastel drawing of the mouse house wren. And then in 1824, Audubon used the drawing from the 1812 as a basis for the bird perched on the old felt hat in the pastel and watercolor rendering. I knew of many nests in old hats, as you see presented in the plate. Look at the little creatures anxiously peeping out to meet their mother, which has just arrived with a spider, while the mouse male is on the lookout, ready to interpose any intruder come near. And this is done in 1812, and this was Audubon and Lucy visited Mill Grove, where he shot this warbler. The bird is done in pastel, the spider wore it in watercolor. Most of Audubon's earliest surviving work is in pencil and pastel. It was during these years that he revolved evolved methods of combining pencil, watercolor, pastel, crayon, ink, oil, and even egg white, while he continued to simulate the texture, sheen, and subtle colorations of his subjects with realism. I did it again. There's a missing slide. Or I didn't say, okay. I will tell you real briefly. The whole Kentucky thing, it went downhill. He wasn't there. Rosier said, no, you're out of here. And so they lost the business. And so then later on, the Audubons, I don't know where that slide went. Anyway, I'm sorry to be human about this. This is supposed to be professional. Anyway, the Audubons formed a partnership with Lucy's brother and built up their trade in Henderson, Kentucky between 1812 and 1819. Times were good. Audubon bought and sold land and slaves, found a flour mill, enjoyed his growing family. After the panic in 1819, Audubon went bankrupt and was thrown into jail for debt. He wrote, "My heart was sorely heavy, for scarcely had I enjoyed to keep my dear ones alive, and yet through these dark days I was being led to develop of the talents I loved." While Audubon is accused of not being a very good businessman, there were very few paintings from this time compared to when he was in Louisville. Audubon had all but abandoned his art of birds during the Henderson years. As he and Lucy discussed their future, the idea of finishing his dream of painting all the birds of America began to take hold. Having a tolerably large number of paintings that would have been generally admired, I concluded that perhaps I could do better than to travel and finish my collection. And so nearly that it would be valuable acquisition before 1819, but this is a painting that was done before 1819, but was included in his Edinburgh exhibition. So he went around and started painting people, and during this time, he decided that his composition was good enough, and he became a deathbed artist. So what that is deathbed people who are dying, but also people who have already died, that, probably real close right after. But yeah, and you think about it, because this is still before cameras, I can imagine that might have been a pretty decent little business. So in 1820, friends asked him, helped him find a job at the newly developed Cincinnati Museum, and he was there doing taxidermy and also preparing such displays that allowed his technical abilities to grow. The appetite of the cedar bird is so extraordinary in nature as to prompt it to devour every fruit or berry that comes in its way. In this manner, they gorge themselves to such excess as sometimes to be unable to fly and suffer themselves to be taken by the hand. Did anybody know this about cedars? Have you heard that? You knew it? Okay, whoa. So Daniel Drake, a prominent Cincinnati physician, encouraged him to think of adding the birds of the Mississippi flyway to his collection, extending the range of the American natural history. The few ornithologists who preceded Audubon had limited their studies to the eastern species. So in spring of 1820, he recruited his best student and to draw backgrounds, bartered for his hunting skills for boat passage on a commercial flatboat, headed for New Orleans, and in October floated off down the Ohio and Mississippi. This drawing of bluebirds was done in 1820 and 1822, and it was a female at left and a young at right, were rendered largely in pencil and pastel. Audubon drew the female and young bird in 1820, later reworked and added the male in Louisiana in 1822. When March returns, the male commences his courtship, manifesting with such tenderness and affection towards his chosen one as the dove itself. Martins and house wrens, be prepared to encounter his anger or keep at respectful distance. Even the wily cat he will torment with querulous chirpings whenever he sees her in the path, from which he wishes to pick up an insect for his mate. This is done in 1820. The painting reveals a variety of mediums Audubon used in his paintings. The gadwall in the foreground was done in watercolor. Its beak coated with egg white and accented with pastel. The loose feathers were rendered in watercolor with pencil accents. The head of the green winged teal in the left background was done in pastel. In journal, Audubon notes that the female, a very old bird and a beautiful one, on the right was collected on Christmas Day, 1820, during his journey down the Mississippi. He drew it in pastel in the next 2 days. Some years afterwards, he cut out the original drawings, posted it on a large sheet of paper, and in watercolor added the male, one of which he collected near Niagara Falls in 1824, and their prey, the green-winged teal and gladwell. This is a whipping crane that he did in 1821, with necks outstretched and long bony legs extended behind. They proceed supported by wings white as the snow, but tipped with het. Reader, see the majestic bird shake his feathers again and range them in order. Proud and beautiful form, and prouder still of its power of flight. It stalks over the withering gases with all the majesty of a gallant chief. Believing he had sufficient progress on his project, Audubon went to Philadelphia in 1824 to see if he could find some support. This was the Intellectual, Scientific, and Publishing Center. And people were kind of intrigued about the American woodsman who dressed in buckskins and slicked his shoulder-length hair with bear grease and vigorously set out to promote his bird book. The intelligentsia of Philadelphia was less than impressed, and he went throughout the eastern coast for 18 months and was not able to find any support or a publisher. This is in 1825, a blue jay. Reader, look at the plate in which all represented 3 individuals of this beautiful species. Rogues though they be, and thieves as I would call them, were it fit for me to pass judgment on their actions. Who could imagine that a form so graceful, arrayed by nature in garb so resplendent, should harbor so much mischief? That selfishness, duplicity, and malice should form the moral accompaniments of so much physical perfection. This is a northern bobwhite and the red-shouldered hawk. I have represented a group of partridges attacked by a red-shouldered hawk. The different attitudes exhibited by the former cannot fail to give you a living idea of the terror and confusion which prevailed on such occasion. This ambitious painting contains 18 bobwhites, males with white throats, females and young. The blades of grass in the foreground were painted separately, then cut out and pasted into position. Oil paint was used in the foreground, and the rest of the combination of watercolor and pastels. In May 1826, Audubon set sail for England. He did carry 150 letters of introduction. So they liked it enough to give him letters of introduction, just not enough to help him. Landing in Manchester, he rented a large room where he hung his art and charged a small amount for people to see his art. While he didn't add much to his bird painting collection, he added people and landscapes, which he sold to have enough money to live on. When his paintings were publicly exhibited in Audubon in 1826, one French critic said, "They brought Europe a fresh, poetic version of America in all its wild abundance. They fired the imagination, as did the man himself, this lithe and handsome woodman. Totally different idea of him in Europe, right? With his curly, chasing hair falling down to his cloudless and his strange and vivid tales. When he displayed prints in Paris 2 years later, the reaction was much the same. Naturalists, artists, and connoisseurs alike hailed the achievement of the New World, the genius of the unannounced in their midst. So Audubon met Robert Ravel in London in 1827, and by mid-July, the first proofs were ready for approval. Audubon thus produced The Birds of America, pay as you go, and managed the complete work in only 10 years. Even though he had to increase the number of plates to 435, more than half of our native birds. Originally etched in copper plates, 87,000 prints were done, black on white outline, and then hand colored. It's estimated that there might have been as many as 40 people simultaneously working on coloring these. He estimated that the 4-volume work issued about 200 copies, cost him in his money $115,000, about $2 million in today's work. Unsupported by gifts, grants, or legacy, he raised almost every penny himself, from painting, exhibiting, and selling subscriptions and skins. During the printing process, he continued to produce art to be included in the series. So between 1827 and 1833, he returned back to the United States, and in 6 months, he completed 42 paintings in a span of 5 months. So he went back and forth between England, trying to sell subscriptions, overseeing the printing, and then returning back to the United States, where he was then working on getting more art. Back in 1812, while visiting his in-laws near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Audubon had his young brother-in-law climb a large tree to inspect a nest. Finding eggs and a bird, the child was instructed to bring the nest and the bird down. Now I have a visual of this. This nest is way high in the tree. And I don't know how old the brother-in-law is, but anyway. So he put a kerchief over the bird's head and brought the nest down. Upon reaching the ground, Audubon was disappointed the hawk wasn't more animated. He wrote, "I measured the length of its bill with my compass, began my outlines, and finished the drawing with the bird without the bird ever moving once." During this process, Lucy read to him. He later released the bird with no further reference to the eggs. And I include this story is because we know he killed the birds, but he didn't kill all of them. And so I thought that was kind of a fun story. And still imagine the brother-in-law climbing up that tree. Anyway, so we've seen the osprey on the left, and now we see another osprey on the right that was done in 1929. The notation at the bottom reads, "Begun Friday at 11 o'clock, finished on Sunday evening. The largest fish which I have ever seen this bird take out of the waters was a weak fish, such as it represented in the plate, but sufficiently large to weigh more than 5 pounds. The bird carried it into the air with difficulty and only dropped it upon hearing the report of the gun fired." So, guess what happened? This is a brown thrasher he did in 1929. This was painted when he was in the East. He wrote, "Reader, look attentively and say if such a scene as that which I have attempted to portray is not calculated to excite the compassion of anyone who is an admirer of woodland melody or who sympathizes with the courageous spirit which the male bird, 2 male birds are directly facing the black snake, shows as he defends his nest and exerts all his powers to extradite his beloved mate from the coils of the vile snake. Audubon reported that in this instance, the thrashers lost their nests and eggs to the snake. But he went on to write, I was happy to contribute my share to the general joy, for on the almost expiring bird into my hand for a few minutes, she recovered, and in some degree I restored her to her anxious mate. So when I visited the southern states and had lived, as it were, amongst these vultures for several years and discovered thousands of times that they did not smell me when I approached them, covered by a tree until within a few feet, and that when so near, at a great distance, I showed myself to them, they instantly flew away, much frightened. The idea evaporated, and I assiduously engaged in a series of experiments to prove to myself at least how far the acuteness of the smell existed. So I read this, and I went, I think he's wrong, because I was on a bird walk with Eric, and we had been up in Mingus Mountain, and we had seen turkey vultures, and he said that they can smell up to 2 miles? Oh, I do. A long distance. But come to find out, so then I did the research, and the turkey vultures can smell, and the black vultures can't. I thought what an amazing adaptation. I thought that was really cool. Okay, Audubon worked with tireless energy and speed to achieve likeness before the colors of the eyes and feet faded as they were quickly did, and to avoid the labor of stuffing a dead model. In the spring of 1821, he struggled for several days to make this image of the heron come alive on paper. By the time he was finished, the bird was aromatic, but Audubon opened the carcass to determine the sex and its eating habits to best represent them in the most appropriate circumstances. Let us pause a while, good reader, and watch the heron. Their contours and movements are always graceful, if not elegant. How calm, how silent, how grand is a scene. Now his golden eye glances over the surrounding objects in surveying which he takes advantage of the full stretch of his graceful neck. Satisfied no danger is near, he lays his head upon his shoulders, allows the feathers of his breast to droop, and patiently awaits the approach of the finned prey. On the 7th of May in 1832, while sailing on the Indian Key, one of the numerous inlets that skirt the southeastern Florida coast, I, for the first time, saw a flock of flamingos. Ah, reader, could you but not know the emotions that then agitated my breast? I thought I had now reached the height of all my expectations. My voyage to the Floridas was undertaken in great measure and for the purpose of studying these lovely birds in their own natural islands. The upper bird was shot near, and this is funny because I didn't realize that I should come to more meetings, I guess, that the poster out there is this poster. The upper bird was shot near Bayou Sara and appeared so uncommon, having 14 tail feathers, all 7 sizes distinct and firmly affixed in 14 different receptacles, that I drew it more to verify one of these astonishing fits of nature. The reader will say that I spared not my labor in this piece. I never do. Nature seems to have implanted in these birds a propensity to destroy. They cut to atoms everything that comes in their way. Even in Audubon's day, this exquisite bird was in decline, slaughtered by man because they were destructive, and for feathers, caught and caged as pets, they were soon exterminated. In December of 1914, the last surviving Carolina parakeet died in the Cincinnati Zoological Gardens. So during this talk, we asked how John Audubon accomplished the extraordinary things he did with the birds of America. Part of what I wanted to share with you was the stories that he wrote about his journey with these birds. He was a man of his time. There's no question about it. He killed almost all of his birds. But everybody in here, maybe, has been to a natural history museum. That's the way it was done. A autopsy, yeah, you bet. Yeah, yeah. But one of the things that I learned from reading this is that I believe that he really cared about his subject. He had a propensity, but he also was wanting to make a living. I think that there was probably some angst with the fact that his wife almost always had to work, although he didn't make any money with his first publishing, but later on, a couple of years later, he and his sons produced the Octa edition, and he was then comfortable for the rest of his life until he died in 1851. So, does anybody have any questions or comments about this very interesting man? Yes, Mary.
To begin again. So a lot of the paintings of the herons, the flamingos, the large birds, have them with their necks down. And I just wondered if that was because of how he had to stage them to fit. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, so I think that's a good idea because I don't know. I thought it was because he wanted to paint them life-size, so he wanted to put them on the big paper. So I think either explanation works. But you're absolutely right. The three big birds that we saw were all bent over.
Well, and I wonder, because he talks about using a wire to get it in some position, and maybe that was just the wire.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good. I think that's a valid observation. Yes, ma'am.
While I was in Louisiana, I got to visit one of the plantations along the Mississippi River where he worked, trying to make some money and also go out and shoot birds and draw them. And he was working for a rich family that had 2 daughters, and besides teaching them history and geography, the last thing he was teaching was hair braiding, is what the signage said. And I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, I can see that. So I think he's a fascinating man, and certainly controversial. But any other final comments? Okay. Thank you very much.
He may have been controversial socially, as we look at it then. But if he'd spent all that time in the South, the people who were his patrons were going to be the people who owned slaves and did all that sort of stuff. I'm interested in the things you were saying about the artistic techniques he was using with combining pastel and watercolor and all the other things that he did. That probably was cutting edge. Or I'm asking you, was that cutting edge for that time?
Well, I think that's why the books were so successful. I think it was not only cutting edge in the United States, but by the reaction of the people. I'm guessing that almost all of his subscriptions came from Europe. We don't know. I never could find, didn't research that, but I'm guessing that it would have made sense that they would have had more money. And at that time, as we were going into the second half of the 19th century, Europeans were fascinated with, the wild rose. But yes, that was interesting. I appreciate that you like that, because that was one of the things that I was intrigued with as an artist, was his commitment to do whatever it took to bring these birds to life. I thought was really interesting and surprised. And I don't know exactly. I'm guessing he did a rough thing when he was out, and then went back and finished them. And once again, how did he know? Even when he was going down the Mississippi, he was doing virgin territory. How did he know the names of? And all of you people who are more ornithologically. I just convert you to any word, but anyway, do you know how did they know? How did he know what the birds were? Well, he did when by the time they were printed. So I don't know. And he had to have, yes, be discovering some new birds. And yet I don't know of any naming that is attributed to him. So anyway, I just leave that with you because that just is still, as somebody who still struggles with naming birds that I see, I am fascinated with the fact that they all got names on them. So, anyway, okay, thank you.